And thank you to all of you. It's really my great pleasure and honor to be here. Of course, thank you to the organizers of the World Government Summit. Of course, thank you to the leaders of Dubai and UAE. But we're able to be here in addition to those people because of all of the people running the cameras, running this room, all of the helpers. And that, for me, is a core message of my remarks today, that in our world, we are all dependent on one another. Our fates and destinies reside in each other, and yet we don't have a sufficient politics that reflects that reality. So my topic today, here we go, is, does our global operating system need an upgrade? And of course, the answer to that question is yes. And how do we know the answer is yes? We know the answer is yes because we are not sufficiently organized to address our biggest challenges. That's the goal, is to solve all our problems. The way we're organized doesn't facilitate that goal. So how do we do it differently? How do we develop a politics that makes it possible for all of us to have the kind of futures where we can thrive and where our future is sustainable? So when we think about changing the global operating system, we're thinking about the whole world. And the world is a big place, and it's often hard to get our arms around what that means. So maybe we should start smaller. Maybe we should even start on the microscopic level. Now, you all know what this is. It's the SARS-CoV-2 virus. As some of you may know, I have been at the center of a debate for over 3 years now, examining the origins of the SARS-CoV-2 virus and of the COVID-19 pandemic. And there are two main hypotheses for how the pandemic began. One is it results from an accidental lab incident in Wuhan, and the other is that it came from the wild animal trade in the Huanan seafood market, also in Wuhan. But regardless of what the origin story is, if it ever should be proven, either one of those cases shows that this was preventable. It was either preventable because of a lab accident, which would have been preventable, or because of the illegal, by Chinese law, trade in wild animals. And it's not just preventable because of that. In the critical early days of the pandemic, there was an information black hole coming out of Wuhan. So the critical information that needed to get out wasn't getting out. There was a lot of misinformation. International experts trying to get to Wuhan to understand what was happening were blocked from doing so. And that was what allowed the stove fire to grow into a kitchen fire and to keep growing. On top of that, as the pandemic began to spread, there was a very poor and uncoordinated global response. And that was what allowed this pandemic to grow bigger and become even deadlier than it otherwise would or could have been. So now we have millions of people who are dead unnecessarily as a result of a pandemic that could have been prevented. And obviously the question that we all need to ask ourselves is why? I mentioned we were going to go from small to big, so now let's go a little bigger. Well, why? You would say, well, we have a World Health Organization. The World Health Organization is an entity that was created to try to prevent exactly this kind of crisis. So why was the World Health Organization not able to prevent this pandemic? Well, the WHO, even though it has this noble and critically important mission, doesn't have the mandate to actually realize it. I'm a huge fan of the WHO. I am a member of the World Health Organization Expert Advisory Committee on Human Genome Editing, and I'm a big fan of Dr. Tedros, who spoke yesterday at this summit. But the leaders of the WHO would be the first to say that they don't have the power and authorities, for example, to have a global pandemic surveillance system. That was why they had to rely on the information that was being provided to them by governments, particularly the Chinese government, which was not accurate. They didn't have the mandate when the Chinese government said, you can't send your experts to Wuhan to say, hey, this is critically important. We're going to send our experts to Wuhan. The budget of the World Health Organization is smaller than the budget of a single average-size teaching hospital in the United States. And on top of that, the WHO Secretariat only controls 20% of its own budget. And because of that, and because of the way the WHO was organized, the WHO does not have the authority to essentially challenge its member states, particularly in cases like this, where member states were actually causing problems. And whether it was China with the origin, or the United States with hoarding vaccines, or just the failure globally to have the kind of international collaboration that we need. All right, so now let's take a bigger step. We went from the SARS-CoV-2 virus to the WHO, and we asked the question, why does the WHO not have those kinds of authorities? And so the next step we can take is to the United Nations system. So as many of you may know, that one of the ideas, of the streams of ideas that led to the creation of the United Nations was a book written in 1795 by the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, where he talked about a league of peace, where countries would come together to try to negotiate their differences. That idea bopped around for more than a century with all kinds of conflicts, and then World War I broke out. And World War I, which, as you know, was labeled the war to end all wars. It was so horrible. The ability to inflict mass slaughter on one another was so great that the people and the leaders who were fighting in World War I said, this is it. When we're done, we're going to build an architecture so this never happens again, the war to end all wars. And at the end of that, with the leadership of President Woodrow Wilson and others, the League of Nations was created. And as we all know, very tragically, the League of Nations failed. For many reasons, not least because my country, the United States, never joined, and then one country after the other began to withdraw. And so the war to end all wars didn't end all wars. And very soon after, we all found ourselves embroiled in the Second World War. And in 1941, in the deepest, darkest moments of World War II, when it really looked like the Germans and the Japanese were actually going to win, US President Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Churchill met on a ship in the Atlantic, and they ironed out and released what became known as the Atlantic Charter. It was a statement of principles about what we were going to fight for, the kind of world. We weren't just fighting to beat the aggressors, we were fighting to build a better world. And using the lessons of the failures of World War I, they articulated that vision. And in 1945, when victory was finally accomplished, the United Nations was created. And that's the year of the United Nations Charter, which has been a remarkable experience for all of humanity. And the United Nations has some critically important successes. It's a forum where different countries can come together and try to negotiate their differences, sometimes more successfully, sometimes less. The specialized agencies of the United Nations are doing critically important work with refugees and disadvantaged persons all around the world, and it's really essential. Most people don't even know don't understand a fraction of what the United Nations is achieving. New concepts that didn't really exist before, ideas like international law, human rights, even the idea of state sovereignty. The brave people in Ukraine are now fighting around an idea of state sovereignty, but there was a time when we lived in a might makes right world. So the United Nations movement has given us tremendous benefits, and our world absolutely is far better off because of that experience. But the United Nations has not lived up to its potential. Not because there's anything wrong with the UN Secretariat, the Secretary General, all of the wonderful, amazing people who are working for the United Nations. The reason is there's a mismatch between the powers given to the United Nations and the nature of the challenges which our world now faces. And if we ask, well, what should be the measure of whether the United Nations is succeeding? In my mind, the measure should be, are we or are we not able to address our world's greatest challenges? And here at this conference, we've been exploring the many areas where we are not able to do so. Climate change, we're here in Dubai, where COP28 will be held later this year. There is no doubt that in spite of all of the meetings, in spite of all of the negotiations, we are not currently on a path to prevent the kind of increasing global warming that's going to fundamentally shift the balance of life on Earth. Pandemics. We are not yet, there's negotiations for the international health regulations, but we are certainly not that much better off than we were in the beginning of COVID-19. We don't have the situations, the protections in place. There are lots of countries in the world that have very weak public health infrastructures. We don't have the structures to facilitate our collaboration. If another pandemic were to break out today, we'd be a little bit better off because of COVID-19, but we are not protected. And we could go on and on down the list of issues where a problem is getting worse and we're not able to solve it. Global poverty and insecurity is another example. Proliferating nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction is yet another. And there's an even worse challenge. If we solve any one of these problems, it won't ultimately matter all that much. If we solve COVID-19 but don't solve pandemics, we're out of the frying pan and into the fire. Let's just say miraculously we come together and solve pandemics, but we don't solve climate change. Again, it's a Pyrrhic victory because we've solved one problem and we haven't solved another existential problem. And let's just imagine in our wildest dreams, we solve pandemics, we solve climate change, we don't solve proliferating nuclear weapons, then it may be a good environment, but it's not going to be an environment for so many of us. The point I'm making is we can spend all of our energy trying to identify and fight specific manifestations of this bigger problem. But unless we do the analysis and recognize, well, what is common to all of these different challenges and address that, we are just constantly going to be moving from one crisis to another crisis. Because the big issue is not any individual crisis, it's this fundamental mismatch between the nature of the challenges we face and the absence of a sufficient framework for addressing that entire category of problems. Our world is fundamentally different from the world of our ancestors not even that long ago. We're deeply connected to each other through all of these kinds of communications and travel and other networks. The power of our technologies is exponentially greater than that of not even our ancestors, of our parents, of our older brothers and sisters. The speed of this transformation is so profound that the consequences of not being able to get a handle on these common challenges is going to be so vast that I believe it poses an existential threat to all of humanity if we don't address it. That was the lesson of COVID-19. None of us, and certainly UAE, this was one of the best protected and the best governed places in the world for COVID-19. But even here and everywhere, none of us can or could build a wall to protect ourselves against pandemics. What the pandemic teaches us, or should teach us, is that our fate and well-being, and all of our fates and well-being, reside in each other. My fate resides in you, your fate resides in me. And not just you and me. Our fates are also connected to all living beings, the biosphere which surrounds us. And unless we are able to have a politics reflecting that new reality, we're going to be in very significant trouble. And so, what is the principle? I believe that principle is the mutual responsibilities of interdependence. And I'm not saying that this is an entirely new framework, but we live in a world of layering. We certainly have nation states which are essential to the way that our world functions. We have the United Nations, which is absolutely essential to the way our world functions. But if we don't very, very quickly add an additional layer, we're going to be in very significant trouble. I am 100% certain that this issue is going to be solved. It's going to be solved in one of two ways. The first way is through staying on the course that we're on and allowing the inevitable crisis to occur. That certainly is what happened in the past. In the first half of the 17th century, in the 1600s, everybody in Europe understood there was a problem of all of these competing claimants to land, to sovereignty. There were religious figures and entities, political figures and entities, and there was all of this overlap. And then Europe plunged into this devastating, murderous 30 Years' War. And at the end of the 30 Years' War, leaders came together and said, hey, we need to do something different. And that's where the idea of the modern nation state came from. Certainly in 1945, at the end of the Second World War, people came together and said, we need a new principle. And that was where the United Nations came from. We are at exactly one of those moments. If we do nothing, we're going to have a crisis, whether it's synthetic biology, pandemic, an ecosystem collapse, a nuclear war, and our future generations, or maybe we ourselves, are going to crawl out of our caves, and we're going to say, we need to do things differently. Let's not leave it to that. The other alternative is a proactive, positive movement now before the crisis happens, before we have 1 billion dead people, around a recognition of our mutual interdependence and responsibilities to one another and to our planet. So how do we do that? The first thing that we need to do is establish what are the principles. Our organization, OneShared.World, came together in the earliest days of the pandemic out of a recognition that we needed to find a new framework, a new way of thinking about our responsibilities to one another. We had people from 120 countries contribute to the drafting of our Declaration of Interdependence, and it's now been translated into 20 languages and growing. But even our movement, as excited as we are about it, and I certainly hope you'll read the declaration, translate it, join it, share it, but even that is not enough. We need something on a much bigger, grander scale. We need the world to come together like we did in 1945, like happened in Europe in 1648 and onward, and to say we need to enshrine this new principle of the mutual responsibilities of interdependence. And this entity, the World Government Summit, actually can play a really important role in that process. And it's not, though, 1941. This isn't just about one person or two people coming together. This is about an inclusive process of everybody. And so to give life to the principles of interdependence, we also need to create an empowered and inclusive movement, a movement that has energy from bottom up, top down, inside out. It took 150 years to go from Kant in 1795 to when the UN Charter was completed in 1945. We don't have that time, so we need to have this kind of movement. And this movement then needs to translate into political pressure on our leaders at every level, certainly including political leaders, but every leader of every organization needs to receive the message, it's great that you are supporting my and our narrow interests, whether as citizens of a specific country or as shareholders of a corporation or anything else. But part of keeping us safe, part of this future, is making sure that you are properly balancing narrower and broader interests. The great American philosopher Henry David Thoreau has a quote saying, if you have built castles in the air, your work need not be lost. That is where they should be. Now put the foundations under them. We need to build the foundations of this future which we would all like to inhabit. Yes, this sounds utopian, and in many ways it is, but the path we are on is unsustainable. The most realistic, careful, cautious, conservative, realpolitik thing that we can possibly do is upgrade our global operating system. We have the word realpolitik. We tend to think of realpolitik as every country out for themselves in a zero-sum world. We need to transition from realpolitik to idealpolitik, recognizing that realizing ideals is not some kind of foofy, soft way of thinking about the world, but it's a way of investing in a future where billions of lives can be saved and must be saved. And it is on us, on every person in this room, every person in the World Government Summit, every person watching this video, and every person in the world to play our role to build the kind of future that we would like to inhabit, because future generations are counting on us. Thank you.